The sand remembers everything. It holds the whispers of gods who walked as men, the footsteps of queens who ruled the sun, and the final breath of a civilization that once believed it would never end. For 3,000 years, Egypt stood as the heart of the ancient world, a kingdom of pyramids and papyrus, of pharaohs who wore the double crown and commanded the Nile itself. But empires, no matter how golden, are not eternal. They rise like the morning star and fall like shadows at dusk. Tonight, we follow the long, quiet descent of a world that once seemed immortal. We walk beside the last pharaohs, watch as foreign armies cross the desert, and witness the moment when the gods fell silent. This is not a story of sudden collapse, but of slow unraveling, a sunset that took centuries to complete. So settle in, let the weight of the day fall away, and journey with me through the twilight of the pharaohs. The sand is waiting to tell its story. If these words carry you gently toward rest, if this story becomes a companion to your quiet hours, consider letting this channel stay by your side. A simple subscription means these histories will find you again, night after night, as the world grows still. No pressure, no urgency, just an invitation to return whenever sleep calls and stories wait. There was a time when the name of Egypt meant power absolute, when pharaohs carved their victories into stone and the gods themselves seemed to walk the temple halls. The new kingdom had been that time, a golden age of conquest and monument, of chariots racing across Syrian plains and tribute flowing in from a dozen conquered lands. Ramses II had built more temples than any king before him, his statues rose like mountains, and his name was chiseled into eternity. Thutmose III had expanded the empire until Egypt's borders touched the edges of the known world. These were the warrior pharaohs, the god-kings who wore the double crown as if it had been made for them alone, and for centuries it seemed that nothing could diminish their light. But empires are not sustained by glory alone. They require gold, grain, soldiers, and the unwavering belief that the center will hold. By the time Ramses III, the last great warrior of the dynasty, fought off the Sea Peoples and Libyan invaders, something fundamental had begun to shift. The victories came, yes, but at terrible cost. The treasury emptied. The army grew weary. And in the great temples of Thebes, the priests of Ammonius counted their wealth and realized they had become richer than the crown itself. Power, which had once flowed from the palace, now pooled in the sanctuaries, and the pharaohs found themselves negotiating with men who claimed to speak for the gods. The 20th dynasty limped forward, each pharaoh weaker than the last, each reign shorter and more troubled. Ramses IV, V, VI, they blur together in history, their names repeated like echoes, their accomplishments pale shadows of their ancestors. Workers at Deir el-Medina, the village that housed the artisans who carved the royal tombs, went unpaid for months. They staged strikes, the first recorded in history, sitting down in front of mortuary temples and refusing to move until grain was delivered. It was a quiet rebellion, but it spoke of something deeper, a fracture in the order that had held Egypt together for 1,000 years. The Nile still flooded, the sun still rose, the rituals continued in the temples as they always had. But beneath the surface, the great machine of Egyptian civilization was grinding slower, its gears worn and misaligned. The royal administration, once a marvel of efficiency, became tangled in corruption and neglect. Tax collectors pocketed what should have gone to the crown. Governors in distant provinces stopped sending reports. The desert roads, once patrolled and safe, became the domain of bandits. And in the south, Nubia, long a source of gold and soldiers, began to pull away, sensing that the grip of Egypt had loosened. By the end of the 20th dynasty, around 1077 BCE, the fiction of unified rule could no longer be maintained. The high priest of Ammonius in Thebes, a man named Herihor, stopped pretending to serve the pharaoh and simply declared himself king of Upper Egypt. In the north, Smendes, a nobleman from the delta city of Tanis, claimed the throne of Lower Egypt. The kingdom split cleanly in two, not through war but through exhaustion, as if the body of Egypt had simply given up trying to hold itself together. The third intermediate period had begun, a name historians would later give to an age of fracture, confusion, and slow decline. It wasn't a sudden collapse. There were no barbarian hordes at the gates, no plagues that emptied cities, no earthquakes that toppled the pyramids. It was subtler than that, more like the way a great tree dies, from the inside out, the bark still strong while the heartwood rots. Egypt remained Egypt. The language was spoken, the gods were worshipped, the old festivals continued. But the certainty was gone. The sense that Egypt was the center of creation, eternal and unshakable, had quietly slipped away. In the delta, where the Nile split into 1,000 fingers reaching toward the Mediterranean, life continued with a strange new normal. Tanis became the seat of the northern pharaohs, a city built on the ruins of older glories, its temples filled with stones stolen from Ptolemais, the once magnificent capital of Ramses II. The kings who ruled from Tanis called themselves pharaohs, wore the crowns, performed the rituals, but their authority barely extended beyond the delta's edge. They were pharaohs of a fragment, rulers of a piece rather than the whole, and everyone knew it, though no one said it aloud. In the south, Thebes held on to its own identity with fierce pride. The high priests of Ammonius ruled there, not as religious figures serving a king, but as kings themselves, wrapped in the authority of the god they served. They controlled vast estates, commanded their own armies, and administered justice in Ammonius' name. The great temple of Karnak became more than a place of worship, it became a palace, a treasury, a fortress. The god's wealth was incalculable, his granaries overflowed, and his priests lived like princes. The pharaoh in the north might send letters requesting tribute or cooperation, but Thebes answered only when it suited them, and often it did not suit them at all. This division was not violent. There were no great battles between north and south, no sieges or burning cities. Instead, there was a kind of exhausted tolerance, a mutual acknowledgement that neither side had the strength or will to force unity. Egypt had become a marriage that had failed but continued out of habit, two partners living in the same house but no longer speaking, each going about their separate lives. And in that separation, smaller powers began to rise. Local governors, nomarchs who had once been appointed by the crown and served at its pleasure, now ruled their districts as independent lords. They built their own armies, collected their own taxes, made their own alliances. Some were loyal to Tanis, others to Thebes, and many to no one but themselves. The great unity that had defined Egypt for millennia, the idea that from the delta to the first cataract there was one land, one crown, one truth, had fractured into a patchwork of competing interests. Egypt had not fallen, but it had fragmented, and in that fragmentation lay a vulnerability that enemies would soon exploit. Foreign influence crept in slowly at first, then faster. Libyan tribes, who had been migrating into the delta for generations, were no longer outsiders. They married into Egyptian families, adopted Egyptian names, worshipped Egyptian gods. Their children grew up speaking the language, learning the prayers, dreaming the same dreams. By the late 21st dynasty, Libyan chiefs held positions of power throughout the delta, commanding garrisons, governing cities, advising pharaohs. They were Egyptian now, or close enough, but their presence signaled something profound. Egypt was no longer a closed world, impervious to outside influence. It was becoming something new, something hybrid, and no one was quite sure what that meant. The 21st dynasty gave way to the 22nd, and when it did, the change was almost seamless. Shoshenq I, a Libyan chief whose family had served Egypt for generations, simply took the throne. There was no coup, no dramatic overthrow, just a quiet transition, as if the crown had been passed at a family dinner. Shoshenq ruled from Tanis, but he understood that legitimacy came from Thebes. So he appointed his own son as high priest of Ammonius, binding north and south together again, not through conquest but through family. It was clever, pragmatic, and for a moment it seemed like it might actually work. Shoshenq was ambitious in ways the recent pharaohs had not been. He looked beyond Egypt's borders and saw opportunities. The kingdoms of Israel and Judah, once tributaries of Egypt, had grown independent during Egypt's period of weakness. Shoshenq marched north with an army, not to conquer but to remind the Levant that Egypt still mattered. He sacked Jerusalem, carried off treasures from Solomon's temple, and returned to Egypt in triumph. It was a victory, real and tangible, and for a brief moment the old fire seemed rekindled. Egypt had struck back. Egypt had shown strength. But it was a last flash of lightning before the storm, a single bright moment that could not sustain itself. Shoshenq's successors lacked his vision and energy. The unity he had forged through family ties began to fray almost immediately. His descendants multiplied, each claiming a piece of power, each ruling a different city, and soon Egypt was divided again, not into two this time, but into many. By the mid-8th century BCE, there were multiple pharaohs ruling simultaneously, each legitimate in their own eyes, each powerless to enforce their will beyond their own territory. The fragmentation became almost absurd in its complexity. A traveler journeying from the delta to Thebes might pass through the territories of 4 or 5 different rulers, each calling themselves pharaoh, each minting coins with their own face, each demanding loyalty as if they commanded all of Egypt. In the delta alone, competing dynasties ruled from Tanis, Sais, Leontopolis, and Mendes. They were cousins, often, or brothers, descendants of Shoshenq's sprawling family tree, but blood ties did not translate into cooperation. They formed alliances, broke them, married each other's daughters, and schemed for advantage in an endless, exhausting dance of petty ambition. Thebes, meanwhile, maintained its own peculiar form of governance. The god's wife of Ammonius, a title held by royal princesses who took vows of celibacy, became the true power in the south. These women were not merely priestesses, they were rulers in all but name, commanding estates, leading rituals, and wielding political authority that even the northern pharaohs had to respect. The position was passed from one princess to another through adoption, creating a parallel dynasty of women who served the god and governed in his shadow. It was an elegant solution to the problem of southern independence, a way to maintain Theban identity without openly challenging the fractured remnants of royal authority in the north. But elegance could not mask vulnerability. Egypt, divided and distracted by its own internal complexities, had stopped paying attention to the wider world. And the wider world had changed dramatically. New powers had risen in the east, kingdoms built on iron rather than bronze, on professional armies rather than conscripted peasants, on centralized bureaucracies that made Egypt's fragmented administration look hopelessly outdated. Assyria, in particular, had become something Egypt had never quite encountered before, an empire built not on cultural superiority or divine mandate, but on systematic, ruthless military efficiency. The Assyrians had spent centuries perfecting the art of conquest. Their armies moved with a speed and coordination that made traditional warfare look slow and clumsy. They used siege engines that could break city walls, cavalry units that could outmaneuver chariots, and intelligence networks that knew their enemies' weaknesses before battle was even joined. More than that, they had developed a policy of deliberate terror. Populations that resisted were massacred or deported, cities that defied them were razed so thoroughly that nothing remained but dust and memory. It was warfare as calculated instrument rather than glorious contest, and it was devastatingly effective. Egypt, fragmented and inward-looking, barely noticed as Assyria swallowed kingdom after kingdom in the Levant. The small states that had once paid tribute to Egypt, Phoenician cities, Syrian principalities, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, fell one by one into Assyrian hands. Refugees fleeing Assyrian advance brought stories of unimaginable cruelty, of entire populations marched into exile, of cities left empty beneath the sun. But in Egypt, the competing pharaohs were too busy watching each other to look east. They heard the stories and dismissed them, or didn't hear them at all. Egypt had always been the greatest power in the world. That was simply the natural order of things. What happened beyond the desert was distant and unimportant. In Nubia, to the south, a different kind of power was growing. The kingdom of Kush had existed in Egypt's shadow for over 1,000 years, sometimes as vassal, sometimes as enemy, always as junior partner. But during Egypt's period of fragmentation, Kush had quietly transformed itself. The Kushite kings had adopted Egyptian culture wholesale, they worshipped Egyptian gods, built Egyptian-style temples, wrote in hieroglyphics, and saw themselves as the true inheritors of pharaonic tradition. In some ways, they were more Egyptian than Egypt itself, preserving ancient customs and rituals that the northern kingdoms had allowed to lapse. King Kashta was the first to move north, extending Kushite influence into Upper Egypt without significant resistance. Thebes, isolated and threatened by the competing dynasties of the Delta, welcomed the Kushites almost as liberators. The god's wife of Ammonius adopted Kashta's daughter, formally bringing Thebes into the Kushite sphere. It was done through ritual and diplomacy, not conquest, but the effect was the same. Southern Egypt now answered to Nubia. The irony was profound and would not have been lost on earlier generations. Egypt, which had colonized Nubia, extracted its gold, and ruled it for centuries, was now being saved by the very people it had once considered inferior. Kashta's son, Pi, went further. He was a man of deep religious conviction, horrified by what he saw as the corruption and impiety of the northern pharaohs. In his view, they had abandoned Ma'at, the ancient concept of cosmic order and justice that was supposed to be the foundation of Egyptian kingship. They neglected the temples, ignored the rituals, fought each other for scraps of power while the land suffered. Pi saw himself as a reformer, a restorer, a pharaoh in the ancient mold who would bring Egypt back to its true path. Around 727 BCE, Pi marched north with an army, not as a foreign invader but as a righteous king coming to restore order to a wayward land. His campaign was recorded in detail on a massive granite stela found at Gebel Barkal, and the text reveals a man who cared as much about proper ritual as military victory. When he captured cities, his first act was to purify himself and visit the local temple to make offerings. When enemy kings surrendered, he rebuked them not for their resistance but for their neglect of the gods. He defeated the northern coalitions, occupied Memphis, and received the submission of most of the Delta kingdoms, but he did not stay. Once order was restored and the temples purified, Pi returned to Nubia, leaving Egypt technically independent but under Kushite influence. The story of how outsiders came to rule Egypt is not one of violent conquest, but of slow absorption and unexpected reverence. The Libyans had arrived in waves over centuries, desert people driven by drought and hunger toward the green abundance of the Nile. At first they came as raiders, then as mercenaries, then as settlers who found empty land in the delta and simply stayed. They learned Egyptian ways, married Egyptian women, named their children with Egyptian names. By the time Shoshenkai took the throne in 945 BCE, the distinction between Libyan and Egyptian had blurred into something new, a hybrid identity that was both and neither, familiar yet foreign. Shoshenk understood the weight of legitimacy in Egypt. Power alone was not enough. A pharaoh needed the blessing of the gods, the acceptance of the priesthood, and the acknowledgement of ancient custom. So he married into the old royal line, appointed his relatives to key positions, and most importantly, placed his son as high priest of Ammonius in Thebes. It was a masterstroke of political theater. By controlling both the throne and the chief religious office, he reunited what the previous dynasties had allowed to split apart. For a generation, perhaps two, it worked. Egypt breathed a little easier. The old rituals continued, tribute flowed to the temples, and the northern pharaoh could credibly claim to rule the whole land. But Shoshenk's line carried within it the seeds of its own fragmentation. The Libyan tradition was not one of primogeniture and centralized power, but of extended family networks and shared authority among chiefs. Shoshenk's descendants multiplied across Egypt, each ruling a city or region, each theoretically loyal to the main line but increasingly independent in practice. His great-grandson Osorkon II tried to maintain unity through force of personality and strategic marriages, building monuments and projecting strength, but the centrifugal forces were too powerful. By the time of Taklot II, civil war had erupted between rival branches of the family, and Egypt once again dissolved into competing kingdoms. The 23rd dynasty emerged not as a replacement but as a parallel reality, another Libyan line claiming pharaonic authority, ruling from Leontopolis while the 22nd dynasty continued in Tanis. Then came the 24th dynasty in Sais, and suddenly there were three competing royal houses, all Libyan in origin, all claiming legitimacy, all functionally independent. The delta became a patchwork of small kingdoms, each with its own pharaoh, each maintaining the fiction of unity while operating as sovereign states. It was almost comical, except that it left Egypt desperately vulnerable at precisely the moment when vulnerability was most dangerous. In this chaos of competing claims and fractured authority, something unexpected happened in the south. The Kushite kings, who had been watching Egypt's decline with a mixture of concern and opportunity, decided that they alone could restore what had been lost. They were not cynical opportunists seeking conquest, they were true believers, more devoted to traditional Egyptian religion than many Egyptians themselves. In their capital at Napata, beneath the sacred mountain of Gebel Barkal, the Kushite rulers built pyramids steeper than any seen in Egypt for 1,000 years. They worshipped Ammonius with fervent devotion, consulted oracles before making decisions, and saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the great pharaohs of old. King Kashta's move into Upper Egypt was gentle, almost tentative. He did not invade Thebes, he was invited. The god's wife of Ammonius, seeing in the Kushites a strength and piety lacking in the northern kingdoms, adopted Kashta's daughter Amenertis as her successor. It was a political masterstroke disguised as religious protocol. Through this one act of ritual adoption, southern Egypt passed peacefully into Kushite hands. No armies clashed, no cities burned. The transition happened in temple ceremonies and formal declarations, and suddenly Nubia, once Egypt's colonial possession, controlled Egypt's spiritual heartland. Kashta's son Pi was a different sort of ruler entirely. Where his father had been cautious, Pi was bold. Where Kashta had been content with Upper Egypt, Pi dreamed of restoring the entire kingdom. Around 727 BCE, word reached Napata that Tefnakht, a powerful prince ruling from Sais in the western delta, had begun conquering his neighbors and assembling a coalition to dominate all of Lower Egypt. Tefnakt's ambitions were explicitly anti-Kushite. He represented the northern kingdom's attempt to resist southern influence and restore native Egyptian rule to the delta. Pi's response was swift but calculated. He sent his armies north in stages, methodically reducing the cities that had joined Tefnakt's coalition. The campaign was recorded in exquisite detail on a massive granite stela that still stands at Gebel Barkal, and the text reveals a king obsessed with proper religious observance. When Pi's forces reached Thebes, he sailed there personally to celebrate the Opet festival before continuing his campaign. When enemy kings sent surrender delegations, he refused to meet them until they had purified themselves according to ancient custom. When he conquered Memphis, Egypt's most sacred city, his first act was to perform the morning ritual in the Temple of Ptah, exactly as pharaohs had done for 2,000 years. The siege of Memphis revealed both Pi's military capability and his deep reverence for Egyptian tradition. The city had been fortified, its walls strengthened and its garrison prepared for a long defense. Tefnakt's coalition had placed their hopes in Memphis. If the ancient capital could hold, the northern resistance might survive. But Pi studied the city with a commander's eye and noticed something the defenders had overlooked. The Nile had risen high that season, and the harbor on the eastern side was poorly guarded, its walls lower where they met the water. He ordered his fleet to sail directly against the harbor fortifications, and his soldiers poured over the walls before the defenders could react. Memphis fell in a single day. Yet Pi's rage was not directed at the soldiers who had resisted him, but at the condition he found inside. The royal stables held horses that had starved during the siege, their ribs showing, some already dead. The stela records his fury in language that seems almost absurd for a military campaign. His Majesty descended to make a great slaughter among them, but his heart was saddened on account of the horses which had been caused to hunger. For Pi, the neglect of animals was evidence of a deeper moral failure, a violation of Mot that justified his entire campaign. He had not come north to conquer Egypt but to save it from rulers who had forgotten what it meant to be pharaoh. The northern kings submitted one by one, traveling to Memphis to prostrate themselves before Pi and offer tribute. Osorkon of Bubastis came, and Iapet of Leontopolis, and Pefjawaibast of Heracleopolis. They brought gold and silver, horses and precious stones, everything they had to offer in exchange for mercy and continued rule. Pi accepted their submission but did not depose them. He restored them to their territories as vassals, requiring only that they govern properly, maintain the temples, and acknowledge Kushite supremacy. Only Tefnakt of Sais refused to appear in person, sending instead an envoy with elaborate oaths of loyalty. Pi accepted even this, pragmatic enough to understand that total submission was less important than functional order. And then, astonishingly, Pi went home. Having conquered Lower Egypt, having received the submission of every major kingdom, having been acknowledged as pharaoh by north and south alike, he simply sailed back up the Nile to Nubia. He left no occupying army, appointed no governors, established no permanent administration in the delta. The northern kings remained in power, theoretically as his vassals but practically as independent rulers once the Kushite army departed. It was as if the entire campaign had been a religious expedition rather than a political one, a mission to restore proper worship and punish impiety, not to build an empire. Historians have puzzled over this decision for centuries. Some see it as evidence of limited ambition, others as practical recognition that Nubia lacked the resources to occupy Egypt permanently. But perhaps Pi simply believed that his work was done. He had demonstrated Kushite power, punished the impious, restored proper ritual, and received acknowledgement as legitimate pharaoh. In his worldview, that might have been enough. Egypt was now under the protection of a righteous king who ruled from the south, and the natural order had been restored. The fact that the northern kings resumed their independence almost immediately might not have concerned him, as long as they maintained the temples and honored the gods, the essential thing had been achieved. Pi's brother and successor, Shabaka, took a different approach. Where Pi had been content with symbolic submission, Shabaka wanted actual control. Around 712 BCE, he marched north again, this time to stay. The 24th dynasty of Sais, founded by Tefnakt's son Baconranef, was ended decisively. According to the Greek historian Manetho, writing centuries later, Shabaka had Baconranef burned alive, though whether this actually happened or was later propaganda is impossible to know. What is certain is that Shabaka established himself in Memphis, ruled from there as resident pharaoh, and began the serious work of governing all of Egypt as a unified kingdom. Shabaka was a builder and a restorer. He commissioned new temples, repaired old ones, and sponsored an extraordinary revival of ancient texts and traditions. The Shabaka stone, now in the British Museum, preserves what he claimed was a copy of an ancient creation text from the Old Kingdom, carefully transcribed from a worm-eaten original. Whether it was truly ancient or a contemporary composition in archaic style matters less than what it represents, a conscious effort to reconnect with Egypt's distant past, to reach back across the centuries of decline and fragmentation to the age when Egypt had been whole and powerful. The Kushite pharaohs saw themselves as more than conquerors. They were restorers, conservatives in the truest sense, dedicated to preserving and reviving what they believed was Egypt's authentic tradition. They built in the old styles, commissioned art that deliberately echoed the masterpieces of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, and enforced religious observances that had been neglected for generations. In some ways, they were right to see themselves this way. While the Libyan dynasties had been Egyptian in culture, they had also been somewhat casual about tradition, mixing foreign and native elements, tolerating religious laxity, allowing the slow erosion of ancient practices. The Kushites, by contrast, were fundamentalists of Egyptian culture, demanding a purity and consistency that native dynasties had ceased to maintain. Shabaka ruled for 15 years, and in that time Egypt knew a stability it had not experienced in generations. The competing dynasties of the Delta were ended or reduced to insignificance. Thebes remained secure under the god's wife of Ammonius, now a Kushite princess who commanded both spiritual and temporal authority in the south. Memphis thrived as the administrative capital, its temples restored, its markets busy, its position as Egypt's ancient heart reaffirmed. For a moment, it seemed possible that the Kushites had actually succeeded in their unlikely mission, that foreign kings from the south had accomplished what native dynasties could not, and made Egypt whole again. But the world beyond Egypt's borders was growing darker. In Mesopotamia, Assyria had reached the height of its terrifying power. Sargon II had conquered Babylon, crushed revolts across his empire, and turned his attention westward. The Levantine kingdoms that had once been Egypt's tributaries now paid homage to Nineveh instead. Phoenician cities, Syrian principalities, even the kingdom of Judah, all had learned to fear the Assyrian war machine. Egypt, reunified but still recovering from centuries of weakness, stood as the last major power not yet incorporated into the Assyrian sphere. Shabaka pursued a policy of cautious engagement, offering support to anti-Assyrian factions in Palestine while avoiding direct confrontation. It was a dangerous game, trying to maintain influence without provoking a war Egypt might not win. When Sargon died in 705 BCE and his son Sennacherib took the throne, rebellion broke out across the Assyrian Empire. King Hezekiah of Judah refused tribute and allied with Egypt, hoping that Kushite military support would allow him to break free from Assyrian domination. Shabaka sent an army north, but it was a token force, cautious and limited. He had no desire to face Assyria in open battle. Shabaka died around 702 BCE, and his nephew Shabitku inherited a kingdom on the edge of crisis. The young pharaoh was more aggressive than his uncle, more willing to challenge Assyria directly. He sent his brother Taharka north with a substantial army to support Hezekiah against Sennacherib's invasion. The two forces met somewhere in Palestine, and for reasons that remain historically murky, Sennacherib withdrew. The Bible records it as a miraculous deliverance, an angel of the Lord striking down the Assyrian army in a single night. Herodotus, writing centuries later, claimed that mice gnawed through the Assyrians' bowstrings and shield straps. Modern historians suggest plague, or strategic calculation, or simply that Sennacherib achieved his objectives without needing to fight a major battle. Whatever the reason, Taharka returned to Egypt as a hero. He had faced down the most powerful empire in the world and emerged victorious. When Shabitku died shortly after, Taharka ascended to the throne with enormous prestige and confidence. He would rule for 26 years, the longest reign of the Kushite dynasty, and in many ways he represented the pinnacle of their achievement. He built extensively throughout Egypt and Nubia, his name appearing on monuments from the Delta to the Fourth Cataract. He dredged canals, restored temples, sponsored festivals, and projected an image of strength and prosperity. But Taharka's confidence would prove tragically misplaced. Sennacherib's withdrawal had not been a defeat, it had been a postponement. And when Assyria returned its attention to Egypt, it would come not with caution but with overwhelming, systematic violence that would shatter the Kushite dream of restored glory and bring the unthinkable to pass, foreign armies marching through Memphis, the sacred city in flames, and the gods of Egypt powerless to defend their own land. The years of Taharka's early reign were peaceful, almost idyllic by the standards of the age. The Nile floods were good, the harvests abundant. Egypt, unified under Kushite rule, experienced an economic and cultural renaissance. Artists produced works of extraordinary quality, deliberately evoking the classical periods while adding their own distinctive style. The fusion of Kushite and Egyptian elements created something unique: pyramids with steeper angles, statues with distinctly African features but Egyptian poses and iconography, temple reliefs that honored ancient convention while incorporating new themes. Taharka himself was a complex figure, both warrior and builder, pious and pragmatic. He claimed to have been chosen by Ammonius through an oracle, legitimizing his rule through divine selection rather than mere succession. He restored the sacred lake at Karnak, building a massive columned hall that still stands today. He erected colossal statues of himself throughout the kingdom, including one at Thebes that stood over 8 feet tall even without its base. These were not merely monuments to vanity but assertions of power, visual declarations that Egypt was strong again, that the age of fragmentation had ended. Yet even as Taharka built and celebrated, the storm was gathering in the east. Sennacherib had been assassinated by his own sons in 681 BCE, but his successor Esarhaddon was even more formidable, younger, more energetic, more determined to complete what his father had begun. Esarhaddon rebuilt Babylon, which his father had destroyed, and used it as a base to consolidate Assyrian power in the east. Once that was secure, he turned his gaze toward Egypt with cold, methodical intent. The conflict began not with a single invasion but with a series of probing attacks and border skirmishes. Assyrian forces pushed into the Sinai, testing Egyptian defenses, gathering intelligence about the kingdom's military capabilities. Taharka responded with his own forces, and for a time the two armies maneuvered without decisive engagement. But Esarhaddon was patient, willing to wait for the right moment, the right conditions. He was preparing something unprecedented, not a raid or a punitive expedition, but a full-scale invasion designed to conquer Egypt entirely and add it to the Assyrian Empire as a subject province. The year 674 BCE brought the first true test of Kushite Egypt against Assyrian might. Esarhaddon crossed the Sinai Desert with an army hardened by decades of constant warfare, veterans who had fought from the mountains of Urartu to the swamps of Babylonia. They came with siege engines, cavalry units, and a logistical system that could supply tens of thousands of men across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain. Egypt had never faced anything quite like this, not the Hyksos with their chariots, not the Sea Peoples with their bronze weapons, not the Libyans with their tribal confederations. The Assyrians were something new in the world, an empire built on industrial-scale violence and bureaucratic efficiency. The first invasion failed. Taharka's forces met the Assyrians somewhere in the eastern delta, and the details are lost to time, but the result is clear: Esarhaddon was forced to retreat. It was a stunning victory for Egypt, proof that the Kushite military could stand against the superpower of the age. Taharka celebrated in the temples, offering thanks to Ammonius for deliverance, and for a moment it seemed that divine favor still rested on Egypt. The gods had protected their land. The old magic still worked. But Esarhaddon was not deterred. He returned to Assyria, reorganized his forces, and began planning a second campaign with meticulous care. 3 years later, in 671 BCE, the Assyrians came again. This time Esarhaddon had learned from his failure. He brought a larger army, better supplied, with detailed intelligence about Egyptian defensive positions. He chose his route carefully, moving swiftly through the Sinai before Egyptian forces could properly mobilize. The Assyrian war machine was designed for this: rapid movement, overwhelming force at the decisive point, psychological warfare through calculated brutality. Cities that surrendered were treated with relative mercy. Cities that resisted were annihilated, their populations enslaved or massacred, their walls torn down stone by stone. The battles of this campaign are recorded in fragmentary Assyrian texts that mix boasting with genuine tactical detail. Esarhaddon claimed to have fought Taharka multiple times, defeating Egyptian armies in the open field and capturing fortified cities throughout the delta. The pharaoh retreated before the Assyrian advance, pulling his forces back toward Memphis, trying to preserve his army for a final defensive stand at the ancient capital. But the Assyrians were relentless. They pushed forward with a speed that left Egyptian defenders disorganized and unable to coordinate resistance. Memphis fell after a siege of 15 days. The Assyrian account is terse but triumphant: from Ishkapri to Memphis, a distance of 15 days' march, I fought daily bloody battles against Taharka, king of Egypt and Kush. 5 times I struck him with the point of my arrows, and I laid siege to Memphis, his royal city, and conquered it in half a day by means of mines, breaches, and assault ladders. The reality was likely more complex and brutal than these spare words suggest. Memphis was one of the most heavily fortified cities in the ancient world, with walls 30 feet high and thick enough to withstand any battering ram. Taking it in half a day, even with exaggeration, speaks to either devastating assault or catastrophic collapse of morale. Taharka escaped. He abandoned Memphis, fled south to Thebes, and from there continued into Nubia, retreating to the safety of his homeland. It was a humiliating flight for a pharaoh who had ruled Egypt for 20 years, who had faced down Sennacherib, who had built monuments from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. But it was also a tactical necessity. As long as he lived and maintained an army, resistance could continue. Egypt was not lost, only occupied. The difference mattered, both symbolically and practically. Esarhaddon did not pursue Taharka into Upper Egypt. The Assyrian army had marched hundreds of miles through hostile territory, fought multiple battles, and besieged Memphis. They needed to consolidate their position, not overextend into the deserts of the south. Instead, Esarhaddon implemented a policy that showed sophisticated understanding of Egyptian politics. Rather than ruling directly through Assyrian governors, which would have provoked endless resistance, he restored many of the delta's local rulers to power as Assyrian vassals. These were the descendants of the old Libyan dynasties, native Egyptians who resented Kushite rule and were willing to collaborate with the invaders if it meant regaining their ancestral positions. The arrangement was cynical but effective. Esarhaddon installed 20 petty kings across the delta, each ruling their own city, each bound by oath to serve Assyria and pay tribute. Necho of Sais, whose family had ruled before the Kushite conquest, was given preeminence among them. These vassal rulers took Assyrian names alongside their Egyptian ones, wore symbols of submission, and allowed Assyrian officials to supervise their administrations. It was a humiliation for Egypt, the land of pharaohs reduced to a collection of puppet states, but it was also a kind of continuity. Egyptian civilization continued, temples remained open, rituals were performed, and daily life went on much as before. The Assyrians wanted tribute and obedience, not cultural annihilation. But occupation breeds resistance, and Egypt's proud traditions could not easily accept foreign domination. Within 2 years of Esarhaddon's departure, Taharqa returned. He marched north from Nubia with a new army, and the Delta rulers who had sworn loyalty to Assyria found their positions suddenly precarious. Some remained loyal to their Assyrian overlords, others hedged their bets, and still others openly welcomed the Kushite restoration. Memphis opened its gates to Taharqa without a fight, the people choosing the familiar pharaoh over the distant empire. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed the occupation might be overthrown entirely. Esarhaddon died before he could respond, struck down by illness while marching to Egypt to crush the rebellion. His death threw Assyria into succession crisis, and for months Egypt's status remained uncertain. But Esarhaddon's son Ashurbanipal proved even more capable than his father. Young, intelligent, ruthless when necessary but also cultured and literate, Ashurbanipal inherited an empire at its peak and was determined to maintain it. In 667 BCE, he launched a third invasion of Egypt, this time with overwhelming force and explicit intent to end Kushite resistance permanently. The Assyrian army that descended on Egypt was the largest yet. Ashurbanipal's records claim forces from across the empire, Babylonians, Medes, Elamites, and soldiers from a dozen other conquered peoples, all marching under Assyrian banners. They moved with practiced efficiency, and this time there was no stopping them. Taharqa's armies were defeated in a series of engagements, and the pharaoh once again fled south. But this time the Assyrians pursued. They pushed beyond Memphis, marching into Upper Egypt, something no Mesopotamian army had ever done before. Thebes itself, the sacred city, Egypt's spiritual heart for 1500 years, came under threat. The city was not taken easily. Thebes had never fallen to foreign conquest in all its long history. Its walls were ancient but strong, its defenders numerous, and its people willing to resist for the sake of their gods. But the Assyrians were patient and methodical. They besieged the city, cut off supplies, and waited for hunger to do what assault might not accomplish. Taharqa died during this period, his heart perhaps broken by seeing his kingdom torn apart. His successor Tantamani tried to rally resistance, briefly recapturing Memphis in a desperate counterattack, but it was a last gasp rather than a true revival. Ashurbanipal's response was merciless. In 663 BCE, Assyrian forces finally breached Thebes' defenses and poured into the sacred city. What followed was one of the great cultural catastrophes of the ancient world. The temples were looted, treasures accumulated over millennia were carted away to Nineveh, statues of gods were toppled or taken as trophies. The Assyrian records boast of the plunder: silver, gold, precious stones, all the possessions of the palace, rich cloth, costly garments, great horses, people male and female, 2 tall obelisks made of shining electrum weighing 2,500 talents, I tore from their bases and carried them off to Assyria. The destruction was so complete that the prophet Nahum, writing a generation later about the fall of Nineveh, would use the sack of Thebes as his ultimate example of divine retribution. Are you better than Thebes? Yet she was taken into exile and went into captivity. Tantamani fled to Nubia and never returned. The Kushite dynasty's rule over Egypt ended not with formal abdication but with simple absence. The pharaohs retreated south of the First Cataract and stayed there, ruling their own kingdom but abandoning their claim to Egypt proper. They would continue to call themselves pharaohs for centuries, building pyramids at Napata and later Meroe, maintaining Egyptian religious practices and hieroglyphic writing. But they never again controlled Egypt itself. Their attempt to restore the ancient glory had failed, broken against the iron reality of Assyrian military superiority. Yet the Assyrians discovered something that would prove fatal to their occupation. Egypt was easy to conquer but almost impossible to hold. The land was vast, the population numerous and restive, and the distance from Nineveh enormous. Every rebellion required another expensive military campaign. Every vassal ruler who seemed loyal might switch sides the moment Assyrian forces withdrew. The Delta kingdoms constantly schemed against each other and against their overlords, playing complex games of alliance and betrayal. Upper Egypt remained hostile, the priesthood of Thebes nursing their wounds and praying for deliverance. Ashurbanipal was many things: a warrior king, a patron of arts and learning, a builder of the great library at Nineveh, but he was not a fool. He understood that direct Assyrian rule over Egypt would drain the empire's resources without commensurate benefit. The garrison costs alone were staggering, and every soldier stationed in the Nile Delta was a soldier unavailable for other frontiers. So he pivoted to a different strategy, one that would prove both clever and ultimately short-sighted. He chose Necho I of Sais, one of the Delta rulers who had remained loyal even during Taharka's return, and elevated him above all the other vassal kings. Necho would be Assyria's chosen instrument, the native pharaoh who ruled with Assyrian backing but Egyptian legitimacy. It was a gamble that recognized a fundamental truth about Egypt: the land could only truly be governed by someone who understood its rhythms, spoke its language, and honored its gods. Necho knew how to navigate the complex web of temple politics, how to speak to the nobility, how to present himself as legitimate pharaoh rather than foreign puppet. And crucially, he was ambitious enough to want real power, not merely the appearance of it. Ashurbanipal gave him authority and military support, and in exchange Necho maintained order and ensured tribute flowed northward. But Necho died in 664 BCE, possibly assassinated by rivals who saw him as a traitor to Egypt. His son Psamtik I inherited a precarious position, nominally the most powerful ruler in Egypt, actually dependent on Assyrian military might to maintain that power against numerous rivals. The young pharaoh found himself ruling a country that despised foreign domination while himself being seen as the chief collaborator with that domination. It was an impossible situation, one that would have destroyed a less capable ruler. But Psamtik proved to be something unexpected, a genius of political manipulation who would transform Egypt's darkest hour into the foundation of its last great dynasty. Psamtik's first challenge was simply surviving. Other Delta rulers contested his authority, some backed by lingering Assyrian support for a divided Egypt, others simply ambitious in their own right. The priesthood of Thebes refused to acknowledge him, seeing any northern ruler as illegitimate after the sack of their city. Upper Egypt remained effectively independent, governed by the god's wife of Ammonius and hostile to any pharaoh who owed his position to foreign conquerors. Psamtik had the title and Assyrian backing, but actual control over perhaps a third of the country at best. His solution was patient, methodical, and brilliant. Rather than demanding submission through force, which he lacked the military strength to impose anyway, Psamtik negotiated. He made alliances with some Delta rulers, married into influential families, bought off others with grants and privileges. He hired Greek mercenaries, soldiers from the expanding world of Mediterranean city-states who fought for pay rather than loyalty and who could provide military strength independent of Assyrian support. This was crucial: as long as his only army was Assyrian, he remained a puppet. But with his own forces, he could begin to act independently. The masterstroke came in his approach to Thebes. Psamtik understood that no pharaoh could truly rule Egypt without the blessing of Ammonius and the acceptance of the southern priesthood. So he did what the Kushites had done before him: he used the institution of the god's wife of Ammonius. In 656 BCE, after years of careful negotiation, he sent his daughter Nitocris to Thebes to be adopted by the current god's wife, Shepenupet II, who was herself the daughter of the Kushite pharaoh Pi. It was a moment of extraordinary symbolism, a princess of the new northern dynasty being accepted by a princess of the vanquished southern dynasty, creating continuity across the divide. The adoption was formalized in an inscription that still survives, detailing the enormous dowry Psamtik provided: gold, silver, land, slaves, everything needed to maintain the god's wife in appropriate splendor. But more important than the material wealth was the political message. Psamtik acknowledged the legitimacy of Theban religious authority and submitted himself to it. In return, Thebes acknowledged him as pharaoh. Upper and Lower Egypt were reunited, not through conquest but through ritual, negotiation, and mutual recognition of shared interest. By 655 BCE, Psamtik had maneuvered himself into effective control of all Egypt. The Assyrian garrison had been withdrawn, not through rebellion but because Ashurbanipal had growing troubles elsewhere in his empire and trusted Psamtik to maintain order without direct supervision. The other Delta rulers had been brought to heel through a combination of diplomacy, marriage alliances, and where necessary, military action by his Greek mercenaries. Thebes had accepted his authority through his daughter's position as heir to the god's wife. And most remarkably, Egypt was at peace, exhausted, traumatized, diminished from its ancient glory, but unified and independent for the first time in nearly a century. Psamtik would rule for 54 years, the longest reign since Ramses II 5 centuries earlier. He founded what historians call the 26th dynasty, or the Sate dynasty after his capital at Sais. His reign marked the beginning of what is sometimes called the Sate Renaissance, a deliberate attempt to revive Egypt's ancient culture and restore its sense of itself after the trauma of foreign domination. Artists studied Old Kingdom masterpieces and created works in conscious imitation of that classical age. Scribes copied ancient texts, preserving literature that might otherwise have been lost. Religious practices that had lapsed during the years of chaos were revived with careful attention to archaic detail. For more than a century after Psamtik I unified the land, Egypt experienced what would prove to be its final period of true independence. The Sate pharaohs ruled with intelligence and pragmatism, understanding that Egypt could no longer dominate the world as it once had but could still survive through careful diplomacy and cultural renewal. They hired Greek mercenaries to strengthen their armies, opened Egypt to Mediterranean trade, and cultivated alliances with rising powers. The workshops of Sais produced art of extraordinary quality, consciously evoking the Old Kingdom while adding their own refinements. Hieroglyphic writing became more elaborate, almost Baroque in its complexity, as if the scribes were trying to prove that Egyptian civilization still possessed depths that foreigners could never touch. But the world continued to change in ways that made isolation impossible. The Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for generations, suddenly collapsed with shocking speed. Internal rebellions, external invasions, and simple exhaustion tore it apart in less than 2 decades. Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, burned so thoroughly that when later Greek travelers passed through, they could not identify which mound of rubble had once been the greatest city in the world. Into the vacuum came new powers, the Babylonians in Mesopotamia and the Medes in Iran, dividing the Assyrian heartland between them. Egypt's pharaohs watched these developments with both hope and anxiety. The destruction of Assyria removed the empire that had humiliated them, but it also created instability that might threaten Egypt's borders. Necho II, Psamtik's son, decided on an aggressive policy. When the Babylonians moved to finish off the remnants of Assyria, Necho marched north with an army to support the Assyrians, not out of loyalty to old enemies, but because a weak, defeated Assyria seemed preferable to a strong, victorious Babylon controlling the Levant. It was a calculated gamble that Egypt was powerful enough to shape events beyond its borders once again. The campaign went badly from the start. At Megiddo in 609 BCE, King Josiah of Judah tried to block the Egyptian army's passage, and Necho's forces killed him in a brief, bitter battle. But this minor victory led to strategic disaster. By the time the Egyptians reached the Euphrates, the Assyrians had already fallen, and Necho found himself facing not a weakened enemy but the full might of the Babylonian army under Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar. At Carchemish in 605 BCE, the two forces met in one of the decisive battles of the ancient world. The Egyptian army was shattered, driven back across the Sinai in humiliating retreat. Egypt's attempt to project power into Asia had ended in catastrophic failure. Nebuchadnezzar pursued the Egyptians to the very borders of Egypt but did not invade. His father had died, and he needed to return to Babylon to secure the throne. But the message was clear: Babylon, not Egypt, would dominate the Levant. The small kingdoms caught between the two powers, Judah, Phoenicia, the cities of Palestine, would look to Babylon for protection or submission, not to the pharaohs. Egypt remained powerful within its own borders, but beyond them its influence had evaporated. The brief Sate dream of restored greatness died at Carchemish, and Egypt turned inward once again, hoping that if it could not dominate, it might at least endure. For 2 generations this strategy worked reasonably well. The later Sate pharaohs, Psamtik II, Apries, Amasis, ruled a prosperous if diminished kingdom. They maintained strong armies, mostly Greek mercenaries who proved more reliable than native Egyptian levies. They fostered trade with the Mediterranean world, and Greek merchants established permanent communities in the Delta, particularly at Naucratis, a city that became a bridge between Egyptian and Hellenic cultures. The temples continued their rituals, the priesthood maintained their power, and ordinary Egyptians went about their lives much as they had for millennia. If Egypt was no longer a superpower, at least it was free and at peace. But in the east, a new storm was gathering. The Median Empire, which had helped destroy Assyria, was itself overthrown in 550 BCE by one of its own vassals. Cyrus II of Persia, later called Cyrus the Great, defeated his Median overlords and inherited their empire. Then he turned his attention to the other great powers of the age. Lydia in Anatolia fell to him, its king Croesus captured despite legendary wealth. The Greek cities of Ionia were absorbed into the Persian sphere. And in 539 BCE, Cyrus entered Babylon without a fight, welcomed as a liberator by a population tired of their own king's eccentricities. In less than 2 decades, Cyrus had built an empire larger than any the world had seen, stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. Egypt watched with growing alarm. Amasis, who had seized the throne in a military coup in 570 BCE and proven himself a capable if unconventional ruler, tried to organize resistance. He formed alliances with Greek city-states, strengthened his army, and fortified Egypt's eastern borders. But he was growing old, and he must have known that the confrontation with Persia would likely come after his death. In 526 BCE, Amasis died and his son Psamtik III inherited the throne. The young pharaoh was brave but inexperienced, and he would rule for less than a year. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, crossed into Egypt in 525 BCE with an army that had conquered half the known world. The Persians had learned from every enemy they faced. They combined Median cavalry with Babylonian siege craft, employed Greek mercenaries alongside Persian nobles, and maintained supply lines that could sustain campaigns across vast distances. They were not wild conquerors driven by religious fervor or barbarian hunger for plunder. They were methodical, organized, and terrifyingly efficient. Egypt's defenses, formidable against raiders or regional rivals, were designed for an older style of warfare and would prove tragically inadequate. The two armies met at Pelusium, the fortress city that guarded Egypt's eastern approaches. Psamtik III had gathered his forces there, native Egyptian soldiers, Greek mercenaries, and contingents from whatever allies remained loyal. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing a generation later, claimed that Cambyses used a psychological trick, driving captured cats and other animals sacred to Egyptians before his army, knowing the Egyptians would not shoot arrows that might harm them. Whether this colorful detail is true or merely a good story is impossible to say. What is certain is that the Battle of Pelusium ended in decisive Persian victory. The defeated pharaoh retreated to Memphis, hoping to make a final stand behind the ancient capital's walls. But the city that had resisted Assyrians for 15 days fell to the Persians with barely a fight. Psamtik III was captured alive, treated initially with some respect as befitting a defeated king, but later executed when Cambyses suspected him of plotting rebellion. The manner of his death varied in ancient accounts. Some said he was forced to drink bull's blood, others that he committed suicide, still others that he was simply killed. The details matter less than the reality. The last native pharaoh of independent Egypt died as a Persian prisoner, and 3,000 years of sovereignty came to an end. Egypt did not become a wasteland or a ruin. The Persians were pragmatic imperialists who understood that a functioning, productive Egypt was more valuable than a devastated one. The temples remained open, the priests continued their rituals, the annual Nile flood still brought life to the fields. Persian officials oversaw tax collection and administration, but much of the daily governance remained in Egyptian hands. The Persian Empire was simply too vast to micromanage every province, it required local cooperation, and it was usually willing to grant cultural autonomy in exchange for political obedience and regular tribute. Cambyses himself tried to present himself as a legitimate pharaoh rather than a foreign conqueror. He was crowned in Memphis with traditional ceremonies, took Egyptian throne names, and made offerings to the gods. Later Egyptian sources would paint him as a monster who killed the sacred Apis bull and desecrated temples, but these were probably propaganda written during rebellions against Persian rule. Contemporary evidence suggests Cambyses actually honored Egyptian religion, at least publicly. He understood that ruling Egypt required more than military force, it required the appearance of legitimacy, the cooperation of the priesthood, and the acceptance of a population that had never known foreign rule until very recently. Yet no matter how tactful the occupation, it remained an occupation. Egypt was now the westernmost province of the Persian Empire, administered from distant Susa and Persepolis, its wealth flowing eastward to build palaces and fund wars that Egyptians had no stake in. The Persian king might wear the double crown when visiting Memphis, but he was not truly pharaoh in the way Egyptians understood the term. He did not embody Mot. He did not maintain the cosmic order. He was simply a powerful foreigner who had conquered them, and no amount of diplomatic theater could fully disguise that fact. Cambyses died in 522 BCE under mysterious circumstances while returning from a failed campaign against Nubia. His death plunged the Persian Empire into civil war, and Egypt erupted in rebellion. For a brief moment it seemed possible that independence might be restored, but Darius I, one of the most capable rulers in Persian history, crushed the rebellions throughout his empire and reimposed control over Egypt. Darius, however, was more sophisticated in his approach than Cambyses had been. He understood that Egypt needed to feel respected, even as it remained subject. Darius commissioned a systematic codification of Egyptian law, bringing together priests and legal experts to compile and organize traditional regulations. He completed the canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, a massive engineering project that had been attempted by earlier pharaohs but never finished. He restored temples, commissioned new inscriptions in hieroglyphics praising his piety, and generally acted the part of a benevolent ruler concerned with his Egyptian subjects' welfare. In the inscriptions at Persepolis, Egypt was listed prominently among the lands that brought tribute, but the tribute included exotic goods and artistic products, not merely raw materials. There was a suggestion of respect, however condescending, for Egyptian civilization. For several decades, this arrangement held. Egypt under Persian rule was not happy, but it was stable and relatively prosperous. The tribute demands were heavy but not crushing. The Persian administration was efficient and largely honest. Persian rule brought Egypt into a vast commercial network stretching from Greece to India, opening new trade opportunities. Greek merchants continued to flock to Egyptian ports. The temples accumulated wealth. Life went on. But resentment simmered beneath the surface calm, and when opportunities arose, Egypt repeatedly attempted to break free. The first major revolt came in 486 BCE, taking advantage of chaos following Darius's death. His son Xerxes crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency and ended any pretense of respectful administration. Where Darius had courted Egyptian sensibilities, Xerxes treated Egypt as conquered territory that needed to be kept in line through force and fear. The tribute demands increased. Temple privileges were curtailed. Persian officials became more intrusive in local affairs. Egypt learned what many conquered peoples before and after would discover: initial lenient occupation often gives way to harsher rule once resistance proves the occupied population cannot be trusted. Xerxes' reign was consumed by his catastrophic invasion of Greece, where Persian armies met unexpected defeat at Salamis and Plataea. The failure demonstrated that Persia was not invincible, that determined resistance could succeed against seemingly overwhelming odds. For Egyptians watching from afar, the Greek victories carried a powerful message: the Persian Empire could be beaten. The gods of Olympus had defended Greece. Perhaps the gods of Egypt might do the same if their people rose again in righteous rebellion. The opportunity came in 460 BCE when a Libyan prince named Inaros, claiming descent from the old Sate kings, raised the standard of revolt in the western delta. This time Egypt had outside support. Athens, now the leading power in Greece and locked in a generational struggle with Persia for control of the Mediterranean, sent a fleet of 200 ships to support the rebellion. It seemed a perfect storm: internal revolt, external support, and a Persian empire distracted by conflicts on multiple fronts. For 6 years the rebellion raged, and at times it appeared it might actually succeed. Egyptian and Athenian forces captured Memphis, except for the citadel where the Persian garrison held out. They controlled most of the Delta and Upper Egypt. But Persian resilience proved stronger than rebel momentum. A new Persian army arrived, commanded by capable generals who had learned from earlier mistakes. They defeated the rebels in a series of engagements, recaptured Memphis, and trapped the Athenian fleet in the Delta. The Greek ships were destroyed, their crews killed or enslaved, and the rebellion collapsed. Inaros was captured and eventually executed, and Persia's control was reimposed more firmly than ever. The failed revolt had consequences beyond immediate military defeat. Egypt had proven itself unreliable, requiring constant vigilance and military occupation. The Persians fortified key positions, maintained larger garrisons, and watched the population with greater suspicion. The period of relatively light-handed rule was over. Egypt would be governed as what it was: hostile territory that needed to be controlled rather than a prosperous province that could be left largely to its own devices. Trust, once broken, could not be restored. For the next 80 years, Egypt remained under Persian control, sometimes tightly governed, sometimes loosely depending on conditions elsewhere in the empire. There were periods of relative peace and periods of tension, but no successful revolts. The Persians had learned how to hold Egypt, maintain strong military presence, cultivate Egyptian collaborators who benefited from Persian rule, and respond to any sign of rebellion with overwhelming force. It was not pleasant for Egyptians, but it was effective for Persians. Then came the moment that would change everything. In 404 BCE, taking advantage of turmoil following the death of the Persian king Darius II, an Egyptian named Amartius led yet another rebellion. This time, improbably, it succeeded. The Persian garrison was driven out, and for the first time in over a century, Egypt was free. Amartius established himself as pharaoh, founding what historians would call the 28th dynasty. It consisted of exactly one king and lasted barely 6 years, but it represented something profound: proof that Persian rule was not permanent, that Egypt could still determine its own destiny. Amartius's dynasty was brief, but it began what historians call the last period of Egyptian independence, 60 years during which native pharaohs ruled Egypt while constantly fighting to preserve that freedom against repeated Persian attempts at reconquest. The 29th and 30th dynasties produced capable rulers who fortified Egypt's borders, hired Greek mercenaries by the thousands, and allied with anyone who opposed Persia. They built temples, restored monuments, and tried desperately to revive the glory of earlier ages while knowing that survival itself was uncertain. Nectanebo I, who seized power in 380 BCE and founded the 30th dynasty, was perhaps the most successful of these last native pharaohs. He repelled multiple Persian invasion attempts, maintained Egypt's independence for 20 years, and built extensively throughout the land. His grandson Nectanebo II continued this work, constructing temples and commissioning art of remarkable quality. But they were building monuments on borrowed time, and everyone must have known it. Persia remained the dominant power in the region, vastly larger and wealthier than Egypt. It was not a question of whether Egypt would fall again, but when. The end came in 343 BCE when the Persian king Artaxerxes III invaded with an overwhelming force. Nectanebo II fought as well as he could, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The Persian army was too large, too well-equipped, too experienced. Egyptian resistance crumbled, and Nectanebo fled south to Nubia, abandoning his kingdom to save his life. He would die there in exile, the last native pharaoh to rule an independent Egypt. The Persians returned as conquerors, and this time there would be no more rebellions, no more brief periods of independence. Egypt's long struggle against Persian domination seemed finally over, its people resigned to permanent subjugation. But history had one more dramatic turn in store. Far to the west, in the kingdom of Macedon, a young prince named Alexander was preparing to change the world. The Persian reconquest of 343 BCE was harsh and unforgiving. Artaxerxes III had learned from decades of Egyptian rebellions and was determined to break any remaining spirit of resistance. Temples were plundered, Egyptian collaborators who had supported Persian rule were rewarded while rebels faced execution or enslavement, and the occupation was administered with an iron fist. Greek mercenaries who had fought for Egyptian independence were hunted down. The priesthood, which had always been a center of Egyptian identity and resistance, found its privileges curtailed and its wealth diminished. This was not the relatively respectful occupation of Darius's era, but something darker, a deliberate policy of humiliation designed to teach Egypt that rebellion was futile. Yet the Persians had overextended themselves. The empire was vast but increasingly hollow, held together by fear and administrative momentum rather than genuine strength. Provincial governors became semi-independent, corruption riddled the system, and the army relied more and more on Greek mercenaries whose loyalty lasted only as long as their pay. In the royal court at Persepolis, intrigue and assassination replaced competent governance. Artaxerxes III himself was poisoned in 338 BCE, and his successors were weak rulers manipulated by courtiers and eunuchs. The empire was rotting from within, waiting for someone to deliver the final blow. That someone was Alexander III of Macedon, 22 years old when he crossed into Asia in 334 BCE with an army of 40,000 men. He was young enough to believe himself invincible, brilliant enough to make that belief reality, and driven by ambitions so vast they seemed like madness. He intended not merely to defeat Persia but to conquer the entire known world, to march to the ends of the earth and plant his standard where no Greek had ever stood. It was the dream of a young man who had been raised on Homer's epics, who saw himself as a second Achilles, destined for glory that would echo through eternity. Alexander's early victories stunned the ancient world. At the Granicus River, then at Issus, he shattered Persian armies that outnumbered his own forces. The Persian king Darius III fled both battlefields, abandoning his troops and his dignity in desperate attempts to save his life. Alexander captured cities, liberated populations that had chafed under Persian rule, and presented himself not as a conqueror but as a liberator bringing freedom and Hellenic civilization to oppressed peoples. It was propaganda, of course, but effective propaganda based on a kernel of truth. Persian rule had grown corrupt and tyrannical, and many welcomed any change. By 332 BCE, Alexander had secured the Levantine coast and stood at Egypt's border. The Persian satrap who governed Egypt took one look at the approaching Macedonian army and surrendered without a fight. There was no battle for Pelusium, no siege of Memphis, no desperate last stand. The Persians simply gave up, and Egypt, after barely a decade of renewed Persian occupation, found itself with yet another foreign ruler. But this time something felt different. The young king who entered Memphis was not interested in exploitation or humiliation. He was interested in glory, legitimacy, and the approval of conquered peoples who might become willing subjects rather than resentful vassals. Alexander was crowned pharaoh in Memphis with full traditional ceremony. He made lavish offerings to the Egyptian gods, particularly to Apis, the sacred bull whose killing Cambyses had allegedly perpetrated. He honored the priesthood, restored temple privileges, and spoke of respecting Egyptian traditions. The priests saw in him what they wanted to see, a legitimate pharaoh who would restore Egypt's dignity after the Persian humiliation. And Alexander, always conscious of theater and symbolism, gave them exactly what they needed to maintain that belief. But Alexander's most famous act in Egypt was not in Memphis but in the western desert. He traveled to the Oracle of Ammonius at the Siwa Oasis, a journey of several weeks through dangerous terrain. What happened there remains one of history's tantalizing mysteries. According to tradition, the oracle's priest greeted Alexander as the son of Ammonius, declaring him not merely king but divine, the child of the supreme Egyptian god. Whether this was genuine religious revelation, political theater arranged in advance, or simply what Alexander wanted to hear, we cannot know. What is certain is that Alexander emerged from Siwa convinced of his own divinity, and Egypt had acknowledged him as pharaoh not merely by conquest but by divine right. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander founded a city. He chose a site on the Mediterranean coast, between Lake Mareotis and the sea, and laid out the plans for what would become Alexandria. It was a brilliant location, protected from desert raiders, accessible to Mediterranean shipping, positioned to control trade between Egypt and the Greek world. Alexander himself marked out the city's boundaries and major streets, then departed, never to return. He marched east toward greater conquests, toward Babylon and Persepolis and the mountains of Afghanistan, toward India and the edge of the world. Egypt had been merely a way station in his grand design, a wealthy province secured and then left behind. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, not yet 33 years old, consumed by fever after years of constant campaigning and perhaps by his own excesses. He left no clear heir, only a half-mad brother and an unborn child, neither capable of holding together an empire that stretched from Greece to India. His generals, the men who had conquered the world at his side, immediately began competing for pieces of the inheritance. The wars of the successors would rage for 40 years, transforming Alexander's unified empire into a collection of rival kingdoms ruled by Macedonian dynasties. Ptolemy, son of Lagos, was one of Alexander's most trusted companions and perhaps his cleverest general. While other successors fought over Macedonia and Asia, Ptolemy moved quickly to secure Egypt. He understood what others did not, that Egypt was not merely wealthy but defensible, that its natural borders of desert and sea made it nearly impossible to conquer if properly governed, and that control of Egypt's grain could give him leverage over any rival. He arrived in Egypt as satrap, appointed by Alexander's regents, but within a few years he was ruling as independent king in all but name. Ptolemy's masterstroke came in 321 BCE when he hijacked Alexander's funeral cortege. The body was being transported from Babylon to Macedonia for burial, but Ptolemy intercepted it and brought it to Egypt, first to Memphis and later to Alexandria. It was an audacious act of political theater. By possessing Alexander's corpse, Ptolemy claimed to be Alexander's true heir, the guardian of his memory and the legitimate successor to his Egyptian kingdom. The other successors were furious, but there was little they could do. Alexander lay in a golden coffin in Alexandria, and Ptolemy used that legitimacy to transform himself from general to pharaoh. By 305 BCE, Ptolemy formally declared himself king, taking the title Ptolemy I Soter, Ptolemy the Savior. He founded a dynasty that would rule Egypt for 3 centuries, the longest-lasting of all the successor kingdoms. The Ptolemies were Greek in language and culture, Macedonian in blood and military tradition, but they understood that to rule Egypt they needed to present themselves as pharaohs. They wore Egyptian crowns in temple ceremonies, made offerings to Egyptian gods, and commissioned hieroglyphic inscriptions praising their piety. Yet they also built Greek cities, patronized Greek culture, and kept themselves somewhat separate from the native Egyptian population. Alexandria became the capital of this hybrid kingdom, a city that was in Egypt but not quite of Egypt. It was Greek in architecture and culture, with a grid of broad streets, marble temples to Greek gods, a magnificent harbor protected by the Pharaohs lighthouse, one of the wonders of the ancient world. But it drew its wealth from Egypt's agriculture, its grain feeding half the Mediterranean, its papyrus supplying the growing bureaucracies of the Hellenistic world. The Ptolemies built the Library of Alexandria, gathering the world's knowledge in one place, and the museum, where scholars studied everything from astronomy to medicine. It became the intellectual capital of the ancient world, where Greek science met Egyptian tradition and produced innovations that would influence civilization for millennia. Yet Alexandria remained foreign to most Egyptians. The native population lived in the ancient cities, Memphis, Thebes, the countless towns along the Nile, and continued their traditional ways much as they had under Persians and Sates and Kushites before. They spoke Egyptian, worshipped Egyptian gods, and viewed the Ptolemies as just another dynasty of foreign rulers, better perhaps than the Persians, but still fundamentally alien. The Ptolemaic administration was Greek, conducted in Greek, by Greek officials who often knew no Egyptian and cared little for native customs beyond what was necessary to maintain order and collect taxes. The early Ptolemies were capable rulers who understood this divide and managed it carefully. Ptolemy II Philadelphus patronized both Greek and Egyptian religious institutions, building temples in traditional Egyptian style while also expanding the library and museum. He commissioned the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, recognizing Alexandria's growing Jewish population. He married his full sister Arsinoe, scandalizing Greeks but following Pharaonic tradition, and together they were worshipped as divine siblings in a cult that blended Greek and Egyptian elements. It was pragmatic syncretism, an attempt to create a unified kingdom from disparate elements. For a century and a half, this system worked remarkably well. The Ptolemaic kingdom was wealthy, powerful, and culturally vibrant. It fought wars with the other Hellenistic kingdoms over territories in Syria and the Aegean, usually holding its own. It maintained the largest navy in the Mediterranean, protecting its commercial interests and projecting power across the sea. Egyptian grain fed the Greek world, and Greek knowledge transformed Egyptian medicine, astronomy, and engineering. The blending of cultures produced remarkable achievements. The Rosetta Stone, carved during Ptolemy V's reign, recorded the same text in Greek, demotic, and hieroglyphics, inadvertently creating the key that would unlock ancient Egyptian writing 2,000 years later. But the dynasty carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The Ptolemies practiced brother-sister marriage to keep power within the family and to claim pharaonic legitimacy, but generations of inbreeding produced weak, unstable rulers prone to mental illness and poor judgment. The succession became increasingly violent, with siblings murdering each other for the throne, mothers poisoning sons, and dynastic civil wars that tore the kingdom apart. By the 2nd century BCE, the Ptolemaic court had become a snake pit of intrigue and assassination, where competence mattered less than ruthlessness and paranoid survival instincts. The great cities still glittered, the harbors still bustled with trade, the temples still received their offerings, but the rot had spread too deep. Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Physcon, Fatty, murdered his own nephew and married his nephew's widow, who was also his own sister. He massacred intellectuals in Alexandria, driving scholars to flee to other cities, diminishing the very cultural achievement that had made the Ptolemaic kingdom exceptional. His successors were no better, weak men dominated by stronger women, or cruel tyrants who ruled through terror, or simply incompetent inheritors of a throne they lacked the capacity to hold. Meanwhile, a new power had risen in the west. Rome, once a modest Italian city-state, had defeated Carthage, conquered Greece, and established dominion over the entire Mediterranean. The Romans were not particularly interested in Egyptian culture or impressed by its ancient heritage. They cared about grain, stability, and ensuring that no rival power could threaten their growing empire. They watched the Ptolemaic kingdoms decline with calculating interest, occasionally intervening to support one claimant or another, always ensuring that Egypt remained too divided to be dangerous but functional enough to keep the grain shipments flowing. By the time Cleopatra VII was born in 69 BCE, the Ptolemaic kingdom was a shadow of its former glory. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was a weak king who had purchased Roman support with enormous bribes, driving the kingdom deeply into debt. He was deposed by his own subjects, restored by Roman force, and ruled the remainder of his life under Roman protection. When he died in 51 BCE, he left the throne to Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, commanding them to rule jointly as husband and wife according to Ptolemaic custom. Neither was old enough to rule effectively, she was 18, he was 10, and within 3 years they were at war with each other. Cleopatra was unlike her recent ancestors in almost every way. She was intelligent, educated, politically astute, and possessed of genuine charisma. She was also the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries to actually learn the Egyptian language, speaking to her subjects in their own tongue, performing rituals in Egyptian temples with genuine fluency. She understood that the dynasty's survival depended not merely on court intrigue but on maintaining legitimacy with both the Greek elite and the native Egyptian population. But she also understood the brutal truth that her predecessors had tried to ignore: Egypt could no longer stand alone. Its survival depended on aligning with Rome, or more precisely, with whichever Roman happened to have power at any given moment. Her opportunity came in 48 BCE when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey. The young Ptolemy XIII's advisors, thinking to curry favor with the victor of Rome's civil war, murdered Pompey and presented his head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar was horrified rather than pleased. Pompey had been his enemy but also his son-in-law and a Roman of great dignity. Murder by foreign servants was an insult to Roman honor. Into this tense situation came Cleopatra, allegedly smuggled into Caesar's presence rolled in a carpet, though the story may be later embellishment. What is certain is that she captivated him, not merely through beauty but through intelligence, charm, and political acuity. Caesar sided with Cleopatra against her brother, and the Alexandrian war that followed nearly cost him his life. Ptolemy XIII's forces besieged the palace quarter, and only Caesar's military genius and the arrival of reinforcements saved him. The young pharaoh drowned in the Nile during the final battle, and Cleopatra was restored to power, nominally sharing the throne with an even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, but actually ruling alone with Caesar's backing. She bore Caesar a son, whom she named Caesarion, Little Caesar, and claimed he was Caesar's heir. It was a bold assertion that Caesar never publicly acknowledged but never explicitly denied either. For 3 years, Cleopatra ruled as Caesar's ally and possibly his lover, though he had a wife in Rome and never married the Egyptian queen. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's position became precarious again. Rome's civil war resumed, this time between Caesar's lieutenants and his assassins, and Egypt had to choose sides carefully to survive. Cleopatra waited, watched, and when the dust settled and Mark Antony emerged as master of Rome's eastern provinces, she made her move. Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in 41 BCE, and she arrived in a display of magnificence calculated to overwhelm. Her barge was gilded, its sails purple, rode to the music of flutes while she reclined beneath a gold canopy dressed as Aphrodite. It was theater on a grand scale, demonstrating that Egypt, though diminished, still possessed wealth and splendor beyond anything Rome could match. Antony was entranced, and their alliance became personal as well as political. He spent the winter in Alexandria, neglecting his duties, and Cleopatra bore him twins. For several years, the arrangement worked to the advantage of both. Antony needed Egypt's wealth to fund his military campaigns against Rome's enemies in the east. Cleopatra needed Roman military power to protect her throne and possibly to restore territories that earlier Ptolemies had lost. Together they formed a partnership that seemed, for a moment, capable of creating a new Eastern empire that could rival Rome itself. Antony married Cleopatra in Egyptian ceremony, though he already had a Roman wife, and their children were declared rulers of various eastern territories. It was a vision of a Hellenistic empire reborn, with Alexandria as its capital and Antony and Cleopatra as its divine rulers. But Rome would not tolerate a Roman general who had gone native, who dressed in Greek clothes, participated in Egyptian rituals, and seemed to have forgotten he was Roman. Antony's rival Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, used these cultural betrayals to paint Antony as a traitor to Rome, seduced by an Oriental queen, planning to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria. The propaganda was effective because it contained enough truth to be believable. Antony had indeed bound himself to Cleopatra and Egypt in ways that seemed to compromise his Roman identity. The Senate declared war, not on Antony but on Cleopatra, framing the coming conflict as Rome versus Egypt rather than Romans versus Romans. The final confrontation came at Actium in 31 BCE, a naval battle off the coast of Greece where Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet faced Octavian's navy commanded by his admiral Agrippa. The battle was not the crushing defeat that later propaganda would suggest, but rather an indecisive engagement that ended when Cleopatra's squadron suddenly sailed away from the battle, and Antony followed her, abandoning his remaining forces. Whether this was a prearranged retreat, a moment of panic, or a strategic withdrawal gone wrong has been debated for 2,000 years. What mattered was the perception: Antony had fled the field with his Egyptian queen, and his remaining forces soon surrendered or deserted. Octavian pursued them to Egypt, taking his time, letting fear and desperation do their work. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, and for nearly a year they lived in a strange twilight, still technically rulers but knowing the end was approaching. They held elaborate parties, made grand gestures, and waited for the inevitable. When Octavian's forces finally arrived in the summer of 30 BCE, resistance collapsed almost immediately. Antony's remaining troops defected or surrendered. The great city that had been the center of Hellenistic civilization opened its gates without a fight. Antony committed suicide, falling on his sword in the Roman manner after receiving false news that Cleopatra was already dead. He was carried dying to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself, and he died in her arms. It was a scene worthy of the Greek tragedies both had probably studied in their youth: the fallen hero and the doomed queen, brought down by ambition, circumstance, and the inexorable logic of power. Cleopatra survived him by a few days, negotiating with Octavian, trying desperately to find some way to preserve her kingdom or at least her children's inheritance. But Octavian had no intention of leaving Egypt independent or allowing any of Cleopatra's children to threaten his position. He intended to display Cleopatra in his triumph in Rome, parading her through the streets as a captive queen, the ultimate symbol of Rome's victory over the East. When Cleopatra realized this was her fate, she chose death. The famous story says she used an asp, a poisonous snake smuggled to her in a basket of figs, dying by the bite of a creature sacred to Egyptian gods. Later historians have questioned whether snake venom actually works that way, suggesting poison of a more conventional kind. But the symbolic power of the asp story proved irresistible, Egypt's last queen dying by Egypt's own sacred serpent, choosing dignity over humiliation. She died on August 10, 30 BCE, 39 years old, having ruled Egypt for 21 years. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Octavian had Caesar Ion, her son by Julius Caesar, hunted down and killed, eliminating the last potential rival to his power. Her children by Antony were taken to Rome to be raised by Antony's Roman widow. Egypt, which had been ruled by pharaohs for 3,000 years, became a Roman province, administered not by the Senate but by Octavian personally as his private property. The Roman administration that followed was efficient, ruthless, and utterly foreign to Egyptian tradition. There would be no more pharaohs, no more double crowns, no more divine kings performing rituals to maintain cosmic order. Instead there were Roman prefects, tax collectors, military garrisons, and the grinding machinery of imperial administration. The temples continued for a while, supported by Roman funding but increasingly irrelevant to a population that was slowly abandoning the old gods for new religions flowing in from the east. The priests kept copying hieroglyphs for a few more centuries, but the knowledge became increasingly rare, until finally no one could read the sacred writing anymore. Alexandria remained a great city, perhaps greater than ever, as Rome's grain supply and a center of commerce and learning. But it was no longer Egyptian in any meaningful sense, it was a Roman city that happened to be located in Egypt. The ancient capital of Memphis was abandoned, its temples left to decay, its statues toppled or carried away. Thebes, the sacred city that had been Egypt's heart for 1,500 years, slowly crumbled into ruin. The villages along the Nile continued their rhythms of planting and harvest, birth and death, but they did so as subjects of an empire that stretched from Britain to Syria, in which Egypt was merely one province among many. The transformation was not sudden, like a door slamming shut, but gradual, like evening fading into night. For generations after Cleopatra's death, Egypt remained recognizably Egyptian. The peasants in their villages still spoke the ancient language, still celebrated festivals that reached back to the time of the pyramids, still saw the Nile's annual flood as a gift from the gods. The temples, though supported now by Roman money rather than pharaonic endowment, continued their rituals. Priests still inscribed hieroglyphs on temple walls, still performed the daily ceremonies that had been performed for 3,000 years. But these were echoes now, growing fainter with each passing generation, the last reverberations of something that had already ended. Rome governed Egypt with a peculiar mixture of respect and exploitation. The emperors understood that Egypt was different from other provinces, that it required special handling. They forbade Roman senators from even visiting without imperial permission, fearing that Egypt's wealth and strategic position might tempt ambitious men to rebellion. They styled themselves as pharaohs in Egyptian temples, allowing priests to inscribe their names in cartouches and present them as legitimate successors to the ancient kings. But this was political theater, empty ritual performed to maintain stability. No Roman emperor truly believed he was the son of Ra or the living embodiment of Horus. They were emperors first, and pharaohs only as a convenient fiction. The grain kept flowing to Rome, millions of bushels every year, feeding the capital's enormous population. Egypt's wealth enriched the imperial treasury, funded Rome's wars, built its monuments. But little of that wealth returned to Egypt itself. The great building projects of the pharaonic age were over. No new pyramids rose, no massive temples were constructed, no colossal statues were carved. The Roman prefects occasionally restored existing temples or completed projects begun by the Ptolemies, but these were maintenance activities, not the grand creative expressions of a confident civilization. Egypt had become a resource to be extracted, not a culture to be celebrated. The old religion lingered longest in the countryside, in villages far from Roman administrators and Greek-speaking cities. There, farmers still made offerings to Osiris for a good harvest, still celebrated the festivals of Hathor and Ptah, still brought their children to local shrines for blessings. But even in these remote places, change was seeping in. Greek had become the language of administration and commerce, necessary for anyone who wanted to advance or even just navigate official business. Egyptian, the language of the pharaohs, became increasingly the language of the illiterate and the poor, something spoken at home but not written, not taught, not valued. And then came new gods from the east. Christianity spread through Egypt in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, carried by merchants and travelers, taking root particularly in Alexandria's cosmopolitan environment. The new religion offered something the old gods could not, a promise of personal salvation, of life after death based not on expensive funerary rites but on faith and moral behavior. For the poor, for slaves, for those at the bottom of Roman Egypt's rigid social hierarchy, Christianity offered hope and dignity that the ancient religion had reserved for pharaohs and nobles. The old gods had been powerful but distant, concerned with cosmic order more than individual suffering. The Christian God was personal, loving, suffering alongside humanity. The temples fought back, but their power was ebbing. The priesthoods that had once been wealthy and influential found their endowments reduced, their political power curtailed, their social relevance questioned. Young men who might once have trained as priests instead learned Greek, studied rhetoric, pursued careers in Roman administration or commerce. The complex knowledge required to read hieroglyphs, to perform rituals correctly, to understand the ancient texts, all of this was becoming a dying art, preserved by smaller and smaller communities of specialists whose expertise no longer commanded respect or resources. The last datable hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae. It was a prayer to the goddess, asking for her blessing, written in the ancient script by priests who may have been among the last people on earth capable of reading the language of the pyramids. After that, silence. The temples continued for a few more decades, increasingly marginalized, until finally the Christian Roman Empire ordered them closed. The Temple of Isis at Philae, the very last functioning temple of the ancient religion, was shuttered in 537 CE by order of the Emperor Justinian. The priests were expelled or converted, the rituals ceased, and 3,000 years of continuous religious tradition came quietly to an end. Egypt did not disappear, of course. The land remained, the Nile still flooded, people still lived and worked and raised children along its banks. But it had become something fundamentally different. Byzantine Egypt, as it was now called, was Christian and Greek-speaking, part of the Eastern Roman Empire, its ancient identity buried under layers of conquest and cultural transformation. The pyramids still stood, mysterious and inexplicable to people who could no longer read the inscriptions on their walls or understand what the strange animal-headed figures in the abandoned temples had represented. When Arab armies arrived in 641 CE, bringing Islam to Egypt, they found a land that had already forgotten its pharaonic past. The peasants spoke Coptic, a late form of the Egyptian language written in Greek letters, and worshipped the Christian god. The great temples were ruins or had been converted into churches. The knowledge of hieroglyphs was so completely lost that the Arabs who marveled at the pyramids and the carved temple walls had no more understanding of their meaning than anyone else. Egypt had become a palimpsest, layers of history written over each other, each new conqueror adding their script while the original text beneath became more and more obscure. The Arab conquest was, in many ways, just another turn of the wheel, one more foreign dynasty ruling the Nile Valley, one more language imposed on the population, one more religion replacing what had come before. But unlike the Persians, the Ptolemies, or the Romans, the Arabs did not leave. They settled, intermarried with the local population, and over centuries transformed Egypt linguistically and religiously. Arabic replaced Coptic as the spoken language, Islam replaced Christianity as the dominant faith, and the last threads connecting modern Egypt to its ancient past were finally severed. Yet something remained. The fellahin, the peasant farmers who worked the land, continued practices that stretched back millennia even if they no longer understood their origins. The rhythm of planting and harvest followed patterns established in the Old Kingdom. Village structures, irrigation techniques, even certain foods and festivals preserved echoes of the pharaonic age, stripped of their original meaning but stubbornly persistent. Egypt's identity had been transformed repeatedly, but the land itself, the Nile's annual miracle, the fundamental reality of living in the Black Land surrounded by the Red Land, these things endured. For over 1,000 years, Egypt's ancient past was lost to itself and to the world. European travelers who visited in the Middle Ages saw the pyramids and temples as curiosities, occasionally as quarries for building stone, but never understood what they represented. The hieroglyphs remained stubbornly mysterious, inspiring wild speculation. Perhaps they were magical symbols, or purely decorative, or the work of giants or aliens or Atlanteans. Anything seemed more plausible than the truth, that they were the written language of a sophisticated civilization that had flourished for 3,000 years and then vanished so completely that even its name for itself had been forgotten. The rediscovery began in 1799 when French soldiers in Napoleon's army found the Rosetta Stone, a fragment of a decree from Ptolemy V's reign carved in 3 scripts, Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic. It took another 23 years before Jean-François Champollion deciphered the hieroglyphs, using the Greek text as a key to unlock the ancient language. And then, slowly, the past began to speak again. Temples were excavated, tombs were opened, papyri were translated, and the voices of the pharaohs, silent for 1,500 years, could be heard once more. What emerged was not what anyone had expected. Egypt had not been a primitive tyranny ruled by cruel god-kings who enslaved millions to build pointless monuments. It had been a complex, sophisticated civilization with advanced mathematics and medicine, with philosophical and religious ideas of remarkable subtlety, with art and literature that could still move readers thousands of years later. The pyramids were not slave-built prisons for dead tyrants but precisely engineered monuments built by skilled workers who took pride in their craft. The hieroglyphs were not magical symbols but a flexible, elegant writing system capable of expressing everything from religious poetry to tax records. And the story of Egypt's fall was not a simple tale of decline and collapse, but something more complex and human. It was a story of how even the mightiest civilizations are vulnerable to time and change, how external pressures and internal weaknesses compound each other, how political fragmentation can leave a nation defenseless even when its culture remains vibrant. It was a story of how foreign rulers could adopt Egyptian culture without truly understanding it, how occupation could be both harsh and respectful, exploitative and preservative. It was a story of how a civilization could die so slowly that the people living through it might not even realize what they were losing. The Kushite pharaohs had loved Egypt enough to try to save it, bringing devotion and military strength from the south, but they could not hold back the Assyrian tide. The Sate pharaohs had restored independence through diplomatic cunning, but they could not make Egypt strong enough to resist Persia. The Persians had conquered and ruled with varying degrees of competence, but they could never quite break Egyptian resistance or inspire Egyptian loyalty. And when Alexander came, bringing liberation from Persian rule, he also brought the beginning of the end, Hellenistic culture that would overlay Egyptian tradition until the original was almost unrecognizable. The Ptolemies had ruled longest, and in some ways best, of all the foreign dynasties. They had respected Egyptian religion, built magnificent temples, and presided over a cultural flowering in Alexandria that benefited all of Mediterranean civilization. But they had also kept themselves separate, creating a dual kingdom where Greek elites and Egyptian peasants lived in the same land but not the same world. And when the dynasty finally collapsed in civil war and Roman conquest, when Cleopatra chose the ASP over chains, Egypt's age as an independent civilization ended with her. Rome made Egypt a province, Christianity made it forget its gods, Islam made it speak a new language, and modernity made it rediscover a past so distant it seemed almost mythical. The Egypt of the pharaohs was gone, as completely as if it had sunk beneath the sea. But in the ruins and the hieroglyphs, in the temples slowly emerging from desert sand, in the fragments of papyri and the gold of funeral masks, the ancient kingdom speaks still. The story ends not with a single moment but with a long fading, like the last light leaving the sky. There is no precise date when pharaonic Egypt died, no dramatic final battle or signing of surrender. Instead, there is Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, which ended the last dynasty that claimed pharaonic legitimacy. There is the closing of the last temples in 537 CE, which ended the last public practice of the ancient religion. There is the final hieroglyphic inscription of 394 CE, which marked the last time anyone wrote in the language of the pyramids. Or perhaps the true end came centuries later, when the last person who could read those inscriptions died, taking with them the final living connection to a world 3,000 years old. What remains now are stones, pyramids that have outlasted the kingdoms that built them, temples carved with prayers to gods no one worships, tombs filled with treasures meant to accompany the dead into an afterlife no one believes in anymore. These stones speak in a language that was lost for over a millennium, telling stories of kings who believed themselves eternal, of a civilization that saw itself as the center of creation, as permanent as the stars. The stones tell the truth that every civilization learns eventually, nothing lasts forever. Not power, not glory, not even the gods themselves. But the stones also tell another truth, quieter and more profound. For 3,000 years, longer than any civilization before or since, Egypt endured. Through droughts and invasions, through collapse and renewal, through foreign occupation and native restoration, the essential identity persisted. The language evolved but remained recognizable. The gods were reinterpreted but kept their names. The rituals adapted but maintained their purpose. This continuity, this stubborn persistence across such a vast span of time, is perhaps Egypt's greatest achievement, not the pyramids or the temples, magnificent as they are, but the simple fact that pharaonic civilization lasted for 3 millennia, longer than the distance separating us from Cleopatra. The fall, when it finally came, was not sudden catastrophe but slow absorption. Foreign rulers learned to speak Egyptian words and wear Egyptian crowns, and in doing so changed what those words and crowns meant. The Libyans ruled as pharaohs while being fundamentally different from native Egyptian rulers. The Kushites were more Egyptian than the Egyptians in their devotion, yet still outsiders. The Persians conquered and occupied, and even their attempts at respectful rule could not disguise the reality of subjugation. Alexander came as liberator and stayed as god, and the Ptolemies created a hybrid culture that was neither purely Greek nor purely Egyptian but something new, brilliant in its own way but disconnected from the ancient roots. Rome simply finished what time and conquest had begun. The empire was too vast, too powerful, too systematic in its administration to allow Egypt any special status beyond what efficiency required. Egypt became a province, valuable for its grain and its wealth but not for its culture or its history. The gods became curiosities, then nuisances, then targets of Christian zeal. The language became a peasant dialect, then a dead language, then hieroglyphs so mysterious that even their nature as writing was questioned. And finally, even the memory faded, until the civilization of the pharaohs existed only in ruins that no one understood and legends that no one quite believed. The rediscovery has been its own kind of resurrection. When Champollion first read hieroglyphs, when archaeologists opened sealed tombs, when scholars translated papyri, the ancient world began speaking again. Not as a living culture, that could never be restored, but as a recovered memory, a conversation across millennia between the people who built the pyramids and the people who now study them. We know more about ancient Egypt now than any generation since the temples closed. We can read their literature, understand their mathematics, trace their history with reasonable accuracy. The pharaohs have names and dates and stories again, rescued from the silence that had claimed them. Yet something essential remains lost and irrecoverable. We can read what they wrote but cannot fully understand what they felt. We can translate their prayers but cannot share their faith. We can map their civilization but cannot truly imagine what it was like to live in a world where the pharaoh was actually, literally divine, where the Nile's flood was the tears of a goddess, where death was not an ending but a transformation. The gulf of time and belief is too vast. Ancient Egypt remains forever foreign, forever mysterious, forever just beyond our complete understanding. And perhaps that is fitting. A civilization that lasted 3,000 years, that built monuments intended to last for eternity, that believed its culture would never end, such a civilization deserves some mystery, some unreachable distance. The pyramids stand against the desert sky, exactly as they were meant to, testimony to ambitions so vast they seem almost absurd. The hieroglyphs carved into temple walls still proclaim the glory of gods and kings, even though both are long gone. The tombs still hold their treasures, or the fragments of treasures, waiting in the darkness for archaeologists who come with questions the ancient dead never imagined. Egypt fell, as all things fall, but it fell so slowly that the process itself became a kind of epic. The last pharaohs fought with courage and cunning, won temporary victories, presided over renaissances that seemed to promise renewal. The gods died hard, lingering in village shrines long after their great temples were closed. The language persisted in altered forms, carrying echoes of the ancient words even as it transformed into something new. Nothing simply disappeared, instead, everything transformed, layer upon layer, until the original was buried but not quite destroyed, waiting for someone to dig deep enough to find it again. The sand holds everything and reveals it slowly, on its own terms. Every decade brings new discoveries, a tomb thought lost to robbers found intact, a cache of papyri preserved in the dry desert air, a temple buried under centuries of Nile silt finally excavated. Each discovery adds to the story, fills gaps in knowledge, sometimes overturns what scholars thought they understood. Ancient Egypt is not a closed chapter but an ongoing revelation, a conversation that continues even though one side has been silent for 1,500 years. The people who live in Egypt today are the inheritors of this immense legacy, though the connection is complex and sometimes uncomfortable. They speak Arabic, not Egyptian. They are Muslim or Christian, not followers of Osiris and Isis. Their country has been shaped by Arab conquest, Ottoman rule, European colonialism, and modern nationalism, layers upon layers of history that have buried the pharaonic past beneath more recent memories. Yet the past is everywhere, impossible to escape. Every field might contain buried antiquities. Every construction project might unearth tombs or temples. The pyramids dominate the horizon at Giza, visible from Cairo's sprawl, ancient and modern existing side by side in uneasy coexistence. For the rest of the world, Egypt has become something else, a symbol, a fascination, a source of endless mystery and romance. The pharaohs appear in films and novels, usually bearing little resemblance to historical reality but capturing something of the grandeur and strangeness that makes ancient Egypt endlessly compelling. The pyramids inspire theories ranging from scholarly to absurd, from precise astronomical alignments to claims of alien construction. Tutankhamun's tomb, found nearly intact in 1922, sparked a global obsession with ancient Egypt that has never quite faded. The golden mask of the boy king has become perhaps the most famous object from the ancient world, his young face staring out across the centuries, beautiful and enigmatic and profoundly sad. There is something about Egypt's fall that speaks to universal human fears. If a civilization that lasted 3,000 years could disappear so completely that even its language was forgotten, what hope is there for any human achievement? If pyramids built to last forever could become mysterious ruins whose purpose was debated, what lasting mark can any of us leave? Egypt's story is a reminder of mortality on a civilizational scale. Empires rise and fall, cultures flourish and fade, and even the mightiest works of human hands eventually become dust beneath the desert sun. But there is also something strangely comforting in Egypt's endurance. 3,000 years is longer than most civilizations exist at all. The pyramids have stood for 45 centuries now, weathered but unbroken, still achieving their purpose of proclaiming the glory of the kings who built them. The hieroglyphs were lost for 1,500 years but not destroyed, they waited patiently in the darkness until someone learned to read them again. The civilization fell, yes, but it fell so slowly, endured so long, left such magnificent remains, that it achieved a kind of immortality after all. Not the literal immortality the ancient Egyptians hoped for, but something real nonetheless, a presence in human memory and imagination that shows no sign of fading. The last pharaohs, Nectanebo fleeing to Nubia, Cleopatra choosing poison over captivity, were defending something already half lost. The world had changed around Egypt, and the old certainties no longer held. New empires with new weapons and new ideas of governance had made the pharaonic system obsolete. The gods who had sustained Egypt for millennia were being questioned, their power doubted, their very existence challenged by new philosophies and religions. The temples still stood, the rituals continued, but they were becoming hollow performances, traditions maintained out of habit rather than conviction. Yet those last rulers fought anyway, knowing perhaps that they were defending not a living civilization but its memory, its dignity, its right to end on its own terms rather than simply be erased. Cleopatra, that most famous of Egypt's queens, was Greek by blood and culture, but she understood what it meant to be pharaoh in ways her Ptolemaic ancestors had not. She learned Egyptian, the first of her dynasty to do so in 3 centuries. She presented herself in temples as the new Isis, the goddess reborn, linking herself to Egypt's most ancient traditions. And when defeat was inevitable, when Octavian's forces controlled Alexandria and her choices were submission or death, she chose death as a pharaoh should, on her own terms, in her own palace, dressed in royal regalia, dying as a queen rather than living as a captive. It was a gesture, theatrical and possibly futile, but gestures matter when everything else is lost. Cleopatra's death did not save Egypt from becoming a Roman province, did not preserve the temples or the priesthood or the language, did not prevent the slow erasure of everything pharaonic Egypt had been. But it asserted something important, that Egypt had agency until the very end, that it chose how it would fall rather than having that choice taken away. The last pharaoh died as pharaohs were meant to die, in dignity and on her own terms, and the 3,000-year tradition ended not with whimpering surrender but with defiant nobility. The sun sets. The desert wind blows across empty temples. The Nile flows as it has always flowed, indifferent to empires and dynasties, marking its seasons without concern for who rules its banks. The pyramids stand against the darkening sky, their limestone facing long since stripped away, their perfect geometry softened by millennia of weathering, but still unmistakably themselves, still proclaiming that pharaohs once walked this earth and believed they would walk it forever. The hieroglyphs remain carved in stone, waiting to be read, telling stories of gods and kings and ordinary people who lived lives we can study but never fully understand. Egypt fell as all things fall, slowly, then suddenly, then not quite completely. The civilization ended, but its monuments endured. The language died, but it was revived. The gods were forgotten, but they are remembered now. Nothing lasts forever, but nothing is entirely lost either. The past remains, buried in sand and stone, waiting for those patient enough to dig, curious enough to ask, humble enough to listen to voices speaking across an almost inconceivable distance of time. And so the story ends where all stories end, in silence and darkness and the patient stones. The pharaohs are gone, but Egypt remains, layered with histories, heavy with memory, still mysterious after all these centuries of study. The fall was complete, but something survives anyway. Not the civilization itself, which cannot be resurrected, but its shadow, its echo, its permanent place in human imagination. The sand remembers everything. And sometimes, if you listen carefully in the quiet hours, you can almost hear it whispering still.